Appreciate you joining me today. We're going to be looking at the account of Paul's shipwreck. One of them, I should say. Our hymn today is We Have an Anchor.
Will your anchor hold in the storms of life when the clouds unfold their wings of strife? When the strong tides lift and the cables strain, will your anchor drift or firm remain? We have an anchor that keeps the soul steadfast and sure while the billows roll, fastened to the rock which cannot move, grounded firm and deep in the Savior's love.
Appreciate it, Lee. In Acts 27, we're picking up right where we left off yesterday. After Agrippa, right, they're going to set sail to Italy. But as they go along, of course, we know what's going to happen. And so they're going along and they're going to switch ships and things along those lines. There's an Alexandrian ship, verse 6. And they're put on board, Paul and others with him, along with other prisoners. And eventually they get caught in a storm. And so, of course, they're not listening to Paul. They're wanting to make their destination. But as these things were happening, verse 13, the south wind blew softly, but not for long. Then you have the storm. And so the ship was caught, could not head into the wind. They let her drive. They just couldn't fight it. Running under the shelter of an island called Clauda, they secured the skiff with difficulty. And when they had taken it on board the little boat, they used cables to undergird the ship, and fearing lest they should run the ground on the Syrtis sands, they struck sail and so were driven. You might consider as they used cables to undergird the ship. Let's make that our first point. In the grand scheme of things, man's ways just don't work. As we think about applications, man's wisdom just doesn't work. When we think about the trials of life and the tribulations that we face, and we think about the fact that the Lord is the only person who has the answer to death. Nobody else does. Man's ways do not work. Man may have figured out how to solve some problems, but please tell me please tell me who has figured out a solution to death. Nope, the Lord's the only one who's done that. And that's because the Lord is the resurrection and the life. Man's wisdom just doesn't work. Here in the ship, they're trying to keep it together, but it's not going to work. And so they start throwing the ship's tackle overboard, and it's just dark as all get out, dark as night, and they're not able to eat. Paul stands up in the midst and says, you should have listened to me and not sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss. But he says, take heart. He says, there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar, and indeed God has granted you all those who sail with you. Therefore take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as it was told me. And the angel said, and indeed God has granted you all those who sail with you. What a wonderful thing. That not only was Paul safe, but it sure does look like Paul had been praying for all those he was with as well. And that the Lord keeps his promises. Paul says, how does he phrase it? I believe God that it will be just as it was told me. God said it, and it will be. But they had to obey. They had to obey. But if they would obey, they would be safe. He says, however, we must run aground on a certain island. Right, so this is what has to happen. They have to run aground, right? They're not pulling into port. They're running aground on a certain island. And that island is going to end up being Malta. And so it's just a lovely account, because when they finally let her drive, okay, as all these things are happening, and they're getting near some land, right, and they can sense it, right? Things start smelling differently. You might be able to discern shadows and things like that. They start taking soundings, and so they're lowering weights, and they are perceiving, or they're able to tell the land is coming up underneath them, so they know they're getting closer. And so, fearing lest they run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern, prayed for day to come. But then you have some sailors, and they're trying to make a break for it, so they let down the skiff into the sea. Paul says, you can't. Nope, he says to the centurion, unless these men stay on the ship, you cannot be saved. And so the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff, and they let it fall. They end up taking nourishment, and they're all encouraged. There's 276 people there. When they'd eaten enough, they throw everything into the sea. When it's day, they did not recognize the land, but they observed a bay with a beach on it, and so they cut loose the anchors and leave them in the sea. And they loose the rudder ropes, and they just let her go. They end up hoisting the sails. They hoisted the mainsail and made for shore, and they struck the place where 2 seas met, and they ran the ship aground. The prow stuck fast, and the sterns being broken up by the violence of the waves. The soldiers were going to kill the prisoners, lest any of them escape, but the centurion, wanting to save Paul, kept them from their purpose and commands everybody to swim for it. Some swam, others came on boards, those who couldn't swim, things like that. And so they all escaped safely to land, and that's how they get to a certain island named Malta. And I love the account, because here they are, the natives of Malta that King James says the barbarous people. The natives showed us unusual kindness. The Lord said, and I think they had to go to a certain island. It was the Lord's will that day the gospel is going to come to Malta, and Malta was not on the scheduled route. The Lord works in mysterious ways. You know how long Paul was on Malta? 3 months. 3 months. I wonder how many of those natives ended up obeying the gospel in those 3 months. I wonder how many of all of those people on board that ship, I wonder how many of them ended up obeying the gospel in those 3 months. The Lord works in mysterious ways. God's ways, or man's ways don't work. But God's ways do work. And so there they are on Malta. Appreciate you. Hope you have a good day. Join us tomorrow for another portion of our daily praise.